But here's the key thing. One day, at about 4:30, at that time of day, a number of us would take a wheelbarrow and go around and pick up broken bricks. Just the ones that have been broken in the course of, put them in the wheelbarrow and take them back and dump them in the clay where they could be reused. Right? Simple. So this one day, I have this wheelbarrow there, and I've got picking up the bricks, and I'm walking toward the kiln. And I stopped. All of a sudden, I stopped, and I realized, I said to myself, I could be in Auschwitz. I could be in Auschwitz making bricks for the Germans. And it kind of really stunned me. I thought, this is what they did, the kind of stuff they did. Which then, of course, made me think of this, for Pharaoh, the bricks, the slavery of bricks, that I was doing the work of a slave. And the question occurred to me, what's the difference? And the difference was that I could go home in 15 minutes. Simple little insight. But I would say let me suggest that this is what slavery is. Slavery is when your time and your space are subject to the will of another. When your time and your space are subject to the will of another. That's what slavery is. Now imagine that, I don't know where the humans go, let's say Pendleton, for example. Let's say the city jail in Pendleton. Let's say I'm in jail there for drunken driving or whatever I'm there for. And you think at 8 o'clock in the morning I'm gonna say, guard, it's time for me to go down to Starbucks and get that latte. Would you come and let me out? And I'll be back about 3. Is that going to happen? Time and space. I'll let you say what the guard might reply. Time and space are subject to the will of another. Now, here I'll introduce that word. This is to lose one's freedom. Freedom. Freedom is what's at stake in this whole business. We begin to see why we might want to think of the promised land to add a word to that. To adequately describe it, it is the promised land of freedom. Freedom. This is not just rhetorical description, it's not just, it is a literal description of what's happening here. Slavery, freedom. So these things there, then if we're to appreciate this, we need to enter into what it means to be a slave, and indeed, not just in general, not just as I've been talking so far, but rather concretely in the experiences of our own life. To discover in our own life the experience of slavery. And it could be various, different. None of the Israelite slaves experienced it in exactly the same way. And neither will we. But this is the disclosure of God, our Creator, about who we are and about what our life is made up of. And so the whole thing is that, well, if He tells me this, then where is it in my life? Where is it in my life? Where is it in the lives of those I love? I'll tell you this, one of the things that most interests me, if you start thinking about this, when I used to be a parish priest and people would make an appointment to come and see me that I hadn't talked to before, in the back of my mind what I would always say to myself is, I wonder where this person is in relation to the promised land. Begin to start thinking in these terms, and because as we'll see, we're not all in the same place. There's a lot of places to be. So we have this experience of slavery, and we just had, as it happens, a most dramatic example of this. The idea, and I don't want, pardon me for repeating, but I really want to drive this home. I think it's very important for us to take it to heart. We had recently the most egregious example of slavery in Cleveland, Ohio. It just got resolved without a trial. Those 3 women that were kept in a house for 10 years. If that isn't enslavement, I don't know what the world would be. But notice what I said. time and place are subject to another. And that's a really good example of what slavery not was, but is today. So, and let me suggest now, more generally, that, well, I think we'll have to, I'll come back to this later because it'll be better to make it a little bit later on, I think. So there we have this, the starting point is that of enslavement and slavery, and let's just see how this looks from heaven in reading number 10. Oh, pardon me. Pardon me. We have to pay attention to this reading number 9 here. There's a little detail we've got to look into here. Reading number 9.
Then the king of Egypt spoke to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Shiphrah, and the other was named Puah. And he said, when you're helping the Hebrew women to give birth, and see them upon the birth stool, if it is a son, then you shall put him to death. But if it is a daughter, then she shall live.
If it is a son, you shall put him to death. If a daughter, she shall live. We saw earlier that Pharaoh had a sort of a premonition about the first aspect of the promise, namely the second aspect, that the Israelites might want to leave the land, that they had a different destiny, physical destiny. Notice, what does this say about the promise? Killing the firstborn sons of the Hebrews. What has that have to do with the promise to Abraham? Descendants, right? Strike against the descendants. Now remember, Pharaoh doesn't know that Abraham is the recipient. This promise even exists, But this is, you might say, and in a sense, we could wonder. Pharaoh is actually often the symbol of the devil, of course. From a different perspective, the symbol of the devil. You could almost wonder that if the devil really doesn't appreciate, is not privy to the promise to Abraham. He could just see from a distance, because God, he can't love, and so this is a conversation of love, and so in effect, Satan can't hear it. He can see the effects, he can see what's happening, but he can't know what's behind it, I suppose. We could imagine. And so here we can say that almost instinctively, just as Pharaoh reacts instinctively against this the increasing fruitfulness of the Israelites, so the devil instinctively reacts against the promise of Abraham, even unconsciously. Now, but even let's focus a little bit more about this, that this is of course, you shall put him, if it is a son, you shall put him to death. Well, how did they put children to death in that time? Born children.
The grandma?
Usually, maybe they did, but exposure. Exposure, as a rule. And I want to focus on that a little bit more too. One of the reasons they did exposure, I was just reading that, Cicero says, at one point says, "Uninam numquam levatus esse." Would that I had never been lifted up. This was at a time of terrible crisis in his life, when it looked like everything was over. And he meant by that, would that my father had never lifted me up. Because when the father of the household lifted up a child, that meant the child could live. If the father didn't lift up the child would be taken out and exposed. Standard. This is just standard Roman practice. And now think of that. I used to think of that as the first thing I used to think about that. I thought is that the child. And imagine this tiny little newborn child. You just take it out there and leave. Let's say take it out there and just leave it there on the rock. Well, the first thing I thought was, well, the child's going to freeze to death. Or it's going to, starve to death, and that's how it's going to. But there's animals out there. There's birds out there. You're at the prey of the wild. This is what was done. It's important for us to get this in our mind. This is the world into which the Word of God comes, huh? And this is now, and I think it's no small thing. This little note is added here. We could imagine telling this story without this incident. You could tell the story that's going to unfold here about the problems of the deliverance of the Israelites without mentioning this. It's not essential to the narrative, except maybe it is in that it tells us something absolutely fundamental about not only ancient Egypt, but about the state in relation to the promise. That what happens is the state will attempt to put an end to the promise by killing if they could have had abortion, they would have done it. Put it that way, right? They didn't know enough about how to do abortion effectively in those days, so exposure was the alternative. But if they had had abortion, they would have done it. And that this suggests that this is the modern counterpart to that is legalized abortion. And that so that again, if you think of it that way, then this story ceases to be something that happened, 5,000 years ago, and becomes a story that's happening today. And that this is what power will do. There's too many people. They'll take over. They're poor. We've got to just get rid of them. And then all that follows from that, it's exceedingly contemporary. But this is a dimension of slavery. Is that when you're a slave, you have no recourse. You have no recourse. And if you're the child of a slave, all the less. You're powerless. But notice that all of this is against the will of the God who comes to save his people. As we see now in reading number 10.
And the sons of Israel sighed because of the bondage, and they cried out, and their cry for help because of their bondage rose up to God. So God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. God saw the sons of Israel, and God took notice of them.
Well, again, this little note, we want to insert this. I know things have reached a terrible pass here for the Israelites with this discrimination, this terrible policy that's put on them now, and yet their cry has reached the Most High. And he says it remembered his covenant with Abraham. Well, in our case, there's another word that's just so charged that I'm not even going to go into that because it's so rich. We're going to have to pass that over. For our purposes, let's substitute the word promise. He remembered his promise to Abraham. And that's, again, that note is sounded, that even despite this attempt to oppress and diminish the numbers of the Israelites, the promise is alive. The promise is alive. So, we're now going through the miracle. This is where this presentation gets really high tech. I got to warn you. You thought it was kind of low tech, but really it's going to be very high tech right now because it's as if we had, imagine yourself, I had a PowerPoint thing here now. And so electronically you'd see these images and suddenly you would just race through the scriptures and be wrapped, all these people would be walking around at fast pace and everything, and we'll go to another part and then we'll slow down and start stalking slow again. Does this make any sense? What I want to do is I want to acknowledge with some regret that I'm just leaving out now vitally important material for our reflection, namely the whole story of Moses and his intervention with Pharaoh and the plagues and all that business. The whole question of Moses and his vocation, it's going to have to presume that and pass over because I want to focus on the key events, just the key events in the story for our purposes now. So let's see what the Israelites are finally come around, and Moses is going to lead them, and indeed he does lead them out. And so we get to this first dramatic incident here at the Red Sea, as we see in reading number 11.
Then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the Lord swept the sea back by a strong east wind all night and turned the sea into dry land, so the waters were divided. The sons of Israel went through the midst of the sea on the dry land. and the waters were like a wall to them on their right hand and on their left. But the sons of Israel walked on dry land through the midst of the sea, and the waters were like a wall to them on their right hand and on their left.
So this is the parting of the waters, and notice there's kind of two aspects of this, as we'll see from the next reading. First is that from the point of view of the Israelites, that we notice that Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the Lord swept the sea. Notice what I said this morning about, or last night, about Moses taking the initiative and tapping the rock. God didn't tell him to tap the rock. This is back where it's pure obedience, that God's power is made manifest and effective precisely through Moses' obedience. The obedience of the one man. Moses is the one that puts his hand over, and God's power works through that, and the waters are parted. Now imagine that if we were there walking through, let's imagine we're walking, suddenly you look back and there's this massive army, can't go back, look ahead, there's this wall of water. Again, it's like telling Abraham that you're going to have a child. It's like telling the Israelites you're going to be free. Here we are. It's impossible. There's no way out. Right? And then unforeseeably the waters part right before us. Can you imagine? And let's say the waters are as high as this. Let's say it's as high as the halfway up the sea, and we have this avenue, suddenly this miraculous avenue ahead of us, and we start to go. But at first you'd be hesitant. You'd be hesitant because how do we know it's not going to come crashing right now? You can imagine it's not going to be. Kind of imagine it's kind of like this. So you gently start to walk forward. Women and men and children, little children holding on each other, and on you go, and then people fall down, so you pick them up, and gradually you get, as the farther along you get, the more you can see the other side. When you start out, it's pretty fearful, but the closer you get to the other side, the more your hope arises that, boy, this is really going to work. And then you get there, and you look back and see what we have just come through. Would you ever forget it? Would you ever forget it? And would you ever cease to tell your children what happened? That reminds me, some of you, I think, know Father Michael Buki. And Father Michael is from Vietnam. His parents are Vietnamese. He was born in the United States. His father was a colonel in the Vietnamese army at the time of the fall of Saigon. He was outside of Saigon on the mission, and he got word to his wife in Saigon. They had, I think, 3 or 4 children at that time. 1975, he said, all right, they had arranged a plan if that happened. And he said, all right, get the money and all this stuff, and then we're going to get out. This is before the Saigon fell, actually, right before it fell. So he came into town. She, in the meantime, got everything together, and then went to pray. I forget the name, a statue of Our Lady of someone or other. And she said, if Our Lady, if you help us, I will offer my son to you as a priest. She made that promise. I would dedicate my son to you as a priest. And so then the husband arrived, and he dressed up as a woman, and they made their way through the city to the boat, and came on the boat, like the boat people, to the States. And now all their children are doctors and lawyers and priests, this wonderful priest. There's a story that's more detailed about the fulfillment of that promise. It's just absolutely marvelous. But my point in saying it is that he told, Father Michael said that when they gather together at Thanksgiving, they have all the relatives gather together, they tell that story every year, so that the next generation will hear it. And I mention it because that's why the Israelites never cease to talk about the parting of the waters. This is an absolutely central experience in the journey of faith. The geography of faith. Notice at that precise place, it's the Red Sea. You can find it, and that is, it happened in time and place, not in myth, not just in somewhere in some other world. And therefore, this parting of the waters is given to us I've kind of emphasized before the importance of the words that are given to us. You know? Slavery, for example, and promise and descent, all these these words that we need to take seriously, but also what are given to us are images. Images, these powerful, powerful images that are known. That's a part of the world's memory, not just the Jewish memory or the Christian memory. The parting of the waters is just this fundamental image, and yet it is ours first of all. It is for you and for me. This is part of our inheritance, is to take that image to heart. And I think that we don't necessarily need to do that consciously, but images, like words too, I guess, but images come to consciousness by association. I had the experience about 25 years ago, before I became a priest, I was in a very, very difficult situation. Went on for 6 months, and it just devoured my life, just dominated my life, dominated my whole life, thoroughly, totally dominated my life. And I sought counsel and everything like this, but after a while, after a number of months, about 4 months, I think, it seemed as if I was standing in front of this wall of water. I'd go to Mass in the morning, and then I'd say, after Mass, I'd go to church and I'd pray, and I'd say, somehow or other, that's how I saw myself, is standing in front of this wall of water, that I couldn't go forward. But I looked back, and it was as if I was being pursued. There was no way to go back and make, you might say, make a place in that, make peace backwards. Had to go forward, and yet there was no way to go forward. And I sought desperately to try to find a way. I talked to people as much as I could, to all kinds of ways to try to go forward, and nothing happened. But I continued to pray about this, and every day, the more and more this image came clear to me, that I'm standing in front of this water, Lord, I just can't go forward. And then one day, that's what happened. I mean, that's what happened to me, and I'll never, obviously, just like the Israelites, I'll never ever forget it. Never forget it. And it was not. I did not part the waters. I did not part the waters. They were parted, and I was able to go through, and then the waters closed behind me. That is to say, that the waters to slavery were closed, and I could go forward on the journey. Now, I mention that because it's a long way from this concrete description. It's a long way from this description, and yet that image was there in my soul, in my memory, in my mind, and it came to light in that situation, which was so well described, which it described so perfectly. And my question to myself has been, what if I had never heard the story of salvation? What if I never knew about this whole geography of faith? What would I have? Maybe, certainly the Lord has ways of rescuing us from disaster, and people that are not believers, certainly He does, no question about it. But at least it really made me conscious of the richness of my inheritance, and how it is literally at the very base of my life and happiness, or unhappiness. If I can be aware that when in time of danger, I can turn to the Lord and beg, just like the Israelites. The Israelites didn't ask, when they cried to God for help, when they were enslaved, they didn't say, now Lord, when we get to the Red Sea, part the waters for us. They didn't plan their way of deliverance. They had no idea how He would. They just trusted that He would find a way to save them. And then when they get there, it's pretty clear, and then you don't have to be told what to do. But then the thing is to always remember standing on the other side and looking back, and never forget what has happened, and to repeat it to generation after generation after generation. So my main point is that this is, in contrast to those words, this is an image. And we're going to come to another one that's counterpart later that I want to suggest is very, very important for us. That's why to be steeped in the Word of God is to just have this incredible richness of spiritual richness that is of the utmost practicality at the same time. Not only for oneself, but for others. So, the parting of the waters is this dramatic stage in the journey to freedom. Now, the problem with this is that I find all this endlessly interesting, and so I kind of pile one thing on top of another, and I'm afraid sometimes I would tax people's attention by doing it. And maybe that's one of the reasons for giving you these texts. It's because I may skip over some of them, but then you can read them and fill in, Maybe we'll leave it at that. I guess I'd draw your attention to briefly the there's the other aspect of this, though. I said there's the aspect of the Israelites, but there's also another aspect of it that we need to take into account, and that is the aspect of those who are coming from the rear, namely the Egyptians. Could somebody read number 12? Number 12.
Then the Egyptians took up the pursuit, and all Pharaoh's horses, his chariots, and his horsemen went in after them into the midst of the sea. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Stretch out your hand over the sea, so that the waters may come back over the Egyptians, over their chariots and their horsemen." So Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the sea returned to its normal state at daybreak, while the Egyptians were fleeing right into it. Then the Lord overthrew the Egyptians in the midst of the sea. The waters returned and covered the chariots and the horsemen, even Pharaoh's entire army that had gone into the sea after them. Not even one of them remained.
And then number 13 adds the note that Israel saw the Egyptians dead on the seashore. So this is a very important note as well, that there's, on the one hand, there's the fact of you might say the fact of going forward and being delivered, but then also to look back and see what happened to the pursuers, that they were absolutely vanquished. It's repeated. There's a number of references to this. This is a theme in the Psalms and so on. They're absolutely destroyed, which is to say the power of Pharaoh was absolutely conquered. And if we think of this as not just Pharaoh but Satan and the struggle of light and darkness and the victory of Christ, this is telling us something. This is another image of, you might say, a resurrection image, if you want. But this is a way of thinking about the resurrection, is that the Christ's victory is total, absolutely total, and death has been destroyed. And that you don't just, the Israelites don't just go through, look back and say, "We sure got through another one." They are also carry with them the memory of the absolute destruction of their enemies, and so should we. So should we. Okay. Now, I think we're at a point here. It's 10:15, and you're probably tired of sitting for. You've been sitting for an hour now. I've been standing and running around for an hour, so it doesn't bother me. We're not as far into this as I had hoped to be, because I keep getting sidetracked on these things. But what time are we supposed to end this? Is this 10 minutes?
Go ahead.
Huh?
Keep going. You got another 15 minutes at least.
Okay, well, let's see if 15 minutes will be good here. Let's see. Well, we'll do another 15 minutes, and we'll get to the second part of this journey, of the journey of faith, the geography of faith. The first stage is Egypt. The second then is the desert. The desert. Now, I'm going to call that, and I would suggest if you find this helpful, that you refer to that in your own mind as the desert of decision. The desert of decision. And we notice that as soon as the Israelites get into the desert, they start at this point, for them, it's a very important note to make.